My name is Daniel Holt. I'm 34 years old, born and raised in the small town of Millhaven, Colorado. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing really happens, until it does. I never considered myself particularly special or unlucky, just an ordinary guy who worked an ordinary job as a construction foreman. But what happened to me on a late spring evening 2 years ago changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin veil that separates the two. The day started like any other. I was overseeing a renovation project at an abandoned office building on the outskirts of town. The building had been neglected for decades, its walls crumbling, floors rotting, and the whole place feeling like it held secrets best left forgotten. Our job was to gut it, reinforce the structure, and turn it into something modern and livable. The crew worked hard through the day, but as evening approached, a storm rolled in. The wind howled, rain pelted the windows, and thunder rumbled so loudly it felt like the earth itself was growling. I should have called it quits for the day, but we were behind schedule. While the others packed up, I decided to stay behind for a little longer to finish some measurements in the basement, a decision I regret more than anything else in my life. The basement was the worst part of the building. The air was damp, the walls were coated in mold, and the faint smell of rot lingered no matter how long the doors stayed open. It was dark too, even with the portable work lights. Shadows seemed to stretch and flicker unnaturally. But I wasn't there to admire the ambience. I just wanted to get the job done and leave. I was kneeling near a support beam, jotting down notes on my clipboard, when I heard it, a faint creak above me, followed by a loud crack. Before I could react, the ceiling buckled. Time seemed to freeze as chunks of concrete, wood, and debris came crashing down around me. I remember a brief, searing pain in my leg, and then the suffocating weight of the rubble pinning me to the ground. I was trapped. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The storm still raged above, but down in that basement, it was like I'd been plunged into a void. The only sounds were my own ragged breaths and the distant drip of water. My flashlight had been knocked aside in the chaos, its beam faintly illuminating the dust-filled air. I couldn't move. My right leg was pinned under a massive slab of concrete, and every attempt to free myself sent waves of pain shooting through my body. At first, I tried yelling for help, but the weight pressing down on my chest made it difficult to draw a full breath. My phone was in my pocket, but when I reached for it, I realized it had been crushed in the collapse. Panic began to set in. No one knew I was still in the building. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it was there. "You're not alone." At first, I thought I was imagining things. The pain, the fear, and the lack of oxygen must have been messing with my head. But then it spoke again. "You don't need to be afraid." The voice was calm, soothing, and undeniably real. It sounded close, as if the speaker were sitting just a few feet away. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. No response, but I could feel it, a presence. I wasn't alone in that basement. The voice continued sporadically over the next few hours, or at least what I assumed were hours. Time became meaningless in that dark, oppressive space. It told me to breathe slowly, to conserve my energy. It reassured me that help was on the way. And, strangely, I believed it. Despite the pain and the crushing fear of dying alone, the voice gave me a sense of calm. It was like having a friend in the darkest moment of my life. But there was something off about it. The voice never introduced itself, never explained how it was there or why. And as the hours dragged on, its tone began to shift. "You should rest," it said at one point, its tone almost tender. "Close your eyes and let go." I refused. Something deep inside me told me that sleeping might mean never waking up. The longer I stayed awake, the more the presence around me felt wrong. The air grew colder, and the sense of calm the voice had brought began to twist into unease. It wasn't just the physical pain or the fear of being buried alive. It was the growing certainty that whatever was down there with me wasn't human. At one point, I tried to look toward the source of the voice, but all I could see were shadows and shifting shapes just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. It was like the darkness itself was alive, watching me, waiting. "You're so tired," the voice said, now sounding almost mournful. "Wouldn't it be easier to let go?" I'll take care of you. No, I whispered, forcing myself to stay conscious. The voice didn't like that. Its tone grew colder, more insistent. Why fight? You're already mine. I began to pray, not because I was particularly religious, but because it felt like the only weapon I had left. I recited every prayer I could remember from childhood, my voice trembling with fear. The voice went silent after that, but the presence remained. I could feel it, circling me, pressing against my mind. Eventually, I heard distant sounds, voices, footsteps, the clatter of tools. Rescue workers. I don't know how they found me, but the relief I felt was overwhelming. When they finally pulled me free, I was barely conscious. As they carried me out, I looked back toward the basement one last time. The shadows seemed to shift, almost like they were retreating, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me leave. In the hospital, the doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. I'd suffered a broken leg, a few cracked ribs, and a concussion, but I'd survive. When I asked the rescue team how they'd found me, they seemed confused. We got a call, one of them said. A man said there was someone trapped in the basement of the building. Gave us exact coordinates. But when we arrived, no one was here except you. I don't know what that voice was, but I've felt its presence ever since. It lingers in the corners of dark rooms, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. You'll be back, it whispers. They always come back. I haven't set foot in that building since, but I know, deep down, that it's waiting for me. My name is Samuel Carter. I'm 41 years old, and I've lived my entire life in Ash Hollow, a small farming town in Nebraska. It's the kind of place where days blend into each other, marked only by the changing seasons and the rhythm of planting and harvest. For most of my life, that routine brought me comfort. But after what happened last summer, I can no longer find peace in the familiar. The day started like any other. The morning sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cornfields. The air was thick with the smell of freshly tilled earth, and the distant hum of tractors echoed through the stillness. I'd been working my family's farm since I was a teenager, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was steady, predictable. That morning, I was out in the south field repairing a fence that had been damaged in a storm the night before. The field bordered a stretch of dense woods that had always given me an uneasy feeling. Even as a child, I'd felt like the trees were watching me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. My parents used to dismiss my fears, calling them wild imaginings. As I worked, I noticed something glinting in the sunlight at the edge of the woods. Curious, I set down my tools and walked toward it. Pushing aside the overgrown brush, I discovered the source of the reflection. An old well, its stone walls weathered and covered in moss. I'd never seen it before, and I was sure it hadn't been there the last time I ventured into these woods. The well seemed ancient, its stones unevenly stacked and crumbling in places. A rusted iron grate covered the opening, but it had partially collapsed inward, leaving a dark, yawning hole that seemed to swallow the light. As I stood there, staring into the abyss, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around the well was noticeably cooler, and the usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, the rustling of leaves, had fallen silent. I leaned in closer, peering into the darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint voice, soft and indistinct, rising up from the depths. It was impossible to make out the words, but there was something desperate in its tone, something that made my heart race. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal trapped below, but deep down, I knew it was neither. I should have walked away. I should have left the well and never looked back. But instead, I found myself drawn to it, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and dread. I grabbed a flashlight from the truck and returned to the well, determined to see what was down there. Shining the beam into the darkness, I could see the walls of the well were slick with moisture, and the faint outline of a rope ladder descended into the depths. It looked ancient, frayed, and fragile, but it was still intact. The voice called out again, clearer this time. It sounded human. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I lowered myself onto the ladder. The rungs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step I took. The light from above quickly faded, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The voice grew louder as I descended, its words still unintelligible but filled with urgency. I lost track of how far I climbed. It felt like an eternity, the only sounds the groaning of the ladder and my own labored breathing. Finally, my feet touched solid ground. The bottom of the well was wider than I'd expected, almost like a cavern. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of earth and decay. My flashlight illuminated the walls, which were covered in strange markings, symbols and patterns etched into the stone. They looked ancient, but they didn't resemble any writing I'd ever seen. And then I saw it. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water, its surface impossibly still. The voice was louder now, echoing off the walls. It was coming from the water. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached, the surface of the pool rippled, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like the air was being sucked out of the room. The voice grew clearer, and for the first time, I understood its words. "Help me." The voice was soft and melodic, almost hypnotic. It filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. I leaned closer to the water, unable to resist. The surface of the pool shimmered, and an image began to form, a face. It was beautiful, almost ethereal, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, and its features seemed to shift and blur, like it couldn't hold its shape. "Help me," it repeated, its voice now tinged with sorrow. "I'm trapped." I reached out instinctively, my fingers hovering just above the water. The air around me seemed to vibrate, and a low hum filled the chamber. But as my hand drew closer to the surface, the markings on the walls began to glow faintly, and the voice changed. It was no longer pleading. It was laughing, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the chamber, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. The face in the water twisted into a grotesque grin, its eyes burning with malevolence. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor and came to rest against the wall. The laughter grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my own panicked thoughts. The pool began to churn violently, sending sprays of icy water into the air. Shapes emerged from the darkness, shadowy figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces, their movements jerky and unnatural. I scrambled to the ladder, my heart pounding. The figures moved closer, their arms outstretched, their laughter mingling with the voice in a cacophony of madness. I climbed as fast as I could, the ladder swaying under my weight. As I ascended, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I kicked out blindly, my foot connecting with something solid, and the pressure released. The voices grew fainter as I climbed, but the laughter lingered, echoing in my mind. When I finally reached the surface, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The woods were silent, the well still and unassuming, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I sealed the well with heavy stones and covered it with dirt, determined to bury whatever evil lay beneath. But the voice haunts me still. I hear it in my dreams, whispering my name, calling me back. I've tried to move on, to forget what I saw, but the well won't let me. It's always there, in the corner of my mind, waiting. And I know one day, I'll have to go back. My name is Evan Miller. I'm 36 years old, and I've lived in Bloomington, Indiana, my entire life. I work as a systems analyst for a mid-sized tech company. It's not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills and lets me live a relatively quiet life. Or at least it used to. I've never been someone who struggles with sleep. If anything, I've always been a deep sleeper, the kind of person who could snooze through thunderstorms or the neighbor's barking dog. So, when the insomnia started, it was unsettling. At first, it was just a night here or there, tossing and turning for no reason. But over the course of a month, it became a nightly ordeal. No matter how tired I felt, as soon as I lay down, my mind raced with fragmented thoughts and nonsensical images. Desperate for rest, I tried everything. Sleep aids, meditation apps, herbal teas, but nothing worked. My doctor suggested stress was the culprit, though I couldn't pinpoint any particular reason for my unease. It was during this period of sleeplessness that the episodes began. The first time, I woke up in my kitchen, standing by the sink with a glass of water in my hand. It startled me, but I brushed it off. Sleepwalking wasn't entirely foreign to me. I'd done it as a child, though I hadn't had an episode in decades. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went back to bed. A few nights later, I woke up again, this time in my living room, sitting on the couch with the TV on static. My hands were trembling, and my mouth was dry. I had no memory of getting there. The frequency of these episodes increased rapidly. I began waking up in different rooms of the house, once even outside on the front porch, barefoot in the freezing cold. But what unnerved me the most was what I found clutched in my hands each time. A small leather-bound journal. I didn't own a journal. The first time I noticed it, I assumed it was something I'd picked up years ago and forgotten about. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, and there was no brand or markings to indicate where it had come from. I tried to ignore it, but when I opened the journal, my blood ran cold. The entries were written in my handwriting, neatly, deliberately, but I didn't remember writing any of them. The first few pages were filled with mundane observations. Notes about the weather, lists of tasks I needed to complete, thoughts about work. It was unsettling but harmless. Then the entries began to change. The handwriting grew erratic, the words sprawling across the pages in uneven lines. The content became darker, filled with descriptions of events that hadn't happened. One entry described a car crash in vivid detail, broken glass, the smell of burning rubber, a scream cutting through the air. Another described a fire, the heat blistering my skin, the sound of wood snapping like brittle bones. None of it made sense. I tried to convince myself it was just a manifestation of stress, a way for my subconscious to work through my anxiety. But the entries didn't stop. One night, I woke up in the basement, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. I hadn't been down there in months. It was mostly storage, filled with old boxes and unused furniture. My heart pounded as I flipped through the journal. The latest entry was fresh, the ink still smudged. It described a woman, a jogger in the park, being followed by someone. It detailed her route, her pace, and the way she glanced over her shoulder in fear. I slammed the journal shut and shoved it into a drawer, determined to forget about it. But the next morning, I saw a news report about a woman who'd gone missing. The details matched the entry. Panic set in. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, a cruel trick of my imagination. But the entries became more frequent and more specific. They described events in horrifying detail. A man being pushed onto train tracks, a child disappearing from a playground, a dog found mutilated in an alley. Each time, I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks, but then I'd see the news, and the details would align perfectly. It wasn't just the accuracy that terrified me, it was the perspective. The entries weren't written from the viewpoint of a bystander or an observer. They were written as if I were the one committing the acts. I started locking the journal away at night, hoping to stop whatever part of me was responsible. But each morning, I'd find it back in my hands, with new entries scrawled across its pages. My exhaustion deepened, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. One particularly grim entry described a man being attacked in a parking garage. It detailed the sound of his screams, the blood pooling beneath him, the look of terror in his eyes. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the news. But when I stepped outside, I saw the police tape cordoning off the garage a block away. I stopped leaving the house, terrified of what I might do, or what I might already have done. I set up cameras in every room, desperate to capture what was happening during the night. When I reviewed the footage, I saw myself wandering the house, the journal always in my hands. But the way I moved was strange, jerky, almost mechanical, as if I were a puppet on invisible strings. In one clip, I watched myself write in the journal. The motion was fluid, deliberate, but my eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the distance. It wasn't me. At least, it didn't feel like me. The final straw came when I found an entry describing my own death. It was disturbingly vivid, detailing the sound of my labored breathing, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, and the cold embrace of the ground beneath me. The last sentence read, "It ends tonight." That night, I didn't sleep. I barricaded the doors, hid the journal in a safe, and sat in the corner of my bedroom with every light in the house turned on. The hours crawled by, each second stretching into an eternity. At some point, I must have blacked out. I woke up outside, lying on the wet grass in the backyard. The journal was in my hands, open to a blank page. My fingers were smeared with ink, and my head throbbed with a splitting pain. I stumbled back inside, shaking uncontrollably. The journal was gone. I tore the house apart looking for it, but it had vanished. The camera showed nothing unusual that night. I've been afraid to sleep ever since. The news reports stopped mentioning incidents that matched the journal's entries. My sleepwalking ceased, and the journal never reappeared. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the faint urge to pick up a pen. My hand hovers over a blank piece of paper, and for a moment, it feels as though I'm not in control. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 29 years old. I grew up in a quiet town in Vermont, in a house that sat on the outskirts of the woods. It was a modest home, nothing particularly special, but it held a strange familiarity for me. After living in the city for a few years, I decided to return home, seeking the solace of my childhood surroundings. What I didn't expect was for my return to stir up something far darker than I could have ever imagined. When I first moved back, I was eager to reconnect with my roots, to relive the comfort of my old life. I spent a few days getting the house ready, cleaning, rearranging, and putting up some pictures to make it feel like home again. But when I uncovered a box of old photographs from my childhood, things started to feel off. The pictures were mostly ordinary, family vacations, birthdays, school events, but one image, buried at the bottom of the box, caught my eye. It was a photo of me, holding hands with a girl I didn't recognize. We were standing in the backyard of the house, beneath the big oak tree where I used to play. Her face was partly obscured by my own, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood. Her hair was dark, and her eyes were unnaturally bright, almost glowing in the dim sunlight of that afternoon. I couldn't understand why I didn't remember her. I had been close to my family, and we'd always taken plenty of pictures together. So why didn't I know this girl? The photograph felt wrong, like a page torn from a book that didn't belong in the story. As I examined the photo, something strange happened. My hands began to tremble, and a rush of memories flooded my mind. I recalled playing in the yard as a child, but these weren't just memories of the usual games I played. These were memories of something else, something darker. I saw myself running through the trees, hiding in the shadows, whispering to someone whose voice I couldn't quite recall. I saw a face, a pale, sickly face with hollow eyes. It was her, the girl in the photograph. I shoved the photo back into the box, my heart racing. For the rest of that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling of the trees outside, felt like a reminder that something was watching me. I tried to push it out of my mind, blaming the stress of moving and the loneliness of being back in this old house. But the unease only grew stronger. The next evening, I decided to go for a walk in the backyard. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that brought the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. As I stood beneath the oak tree, I felt a sharp pang of recognition. This was where I had played as a child, where I'd spent countless hours pretending to be an adventurer or a princess. But as I gazed around, the place felt unfamiliar, as if the memories were warped somehow, distant. And then, I saw something, or rather, someone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the fading light. It was a child, but the shape was vague, like a silhouette against the twilight. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches overhead. But then the figure moved. I felt a chill race down my spine. The figure stepped forward, closer to me, but the moment I tried to focus on it, it vanished. The yard was empty again. I rushed back into the house, my pulse pounding in my ears. The thought of that face, familiar and alien at the same time, haunted me. The memories of the girl in the photograph, the one I had forgotten, kept resurfacing. I had to know more. That night, I went through the old family albums again, this time with a more frantic energy. I flipped through page after page, searching for any sign of her, but she didn't appear again. Instead, I came across something far worse, an entry in a diary my mother had kept when I was a child. It was a simple, handwritten note. Emily and Lucy played together in the backyard today. I'm glad she has someone to spend time with. She's such a lonely child. But Lucy seems to understand her. I froze. Lucy? Who was Lucy? I didn't remember any child named Lucy. The only friend I'd had was Sarah, and even she was a distant memory. But Lucy? The name sounded so familiar, yet completely foreign. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I hadn't heard that name since I was young. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Lucy, something hidden beneath the surface of my childhood that I had repressed, buried deep within my mind. Days passed, and I became consumed by the mystery of this girl, Lucy. I visited my old childhood friends, hoping to uncover some fragment of truth, but they had no memory of a girl named Lucy. I even asked my parents, but they dismissed the question with a nervous laugh. "You must have imagined her," they said. "You were always such an imaginative child." But I knew it wasn't imagination. One afternoon, I went back to the backyard, this time with the intention of finding something, anything, that might explain what was happening. As I walked through the trees, I noticed something strange near the base of the oak tree, a set of small footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were too small, too delicate. They led to a small, hidden nook in the branches of the tree, a place I had never noticed before. I climbed up, my heart hammering, and in that nook, I found something horrifying. It was a small, tattered doll, its once bright dress now faded and stained. The doll's face was painted in an unsettlingly lifelike manner, with sharp, exaggerated features that seemed to leer at me as I picked it up. I couldn't breathe. This doll, it felt wrong. It felt like something that had been left for me to find, as though I had been drawn here by some unseen force. I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The backyard was empty, the only sound the wind whispering through the branches. But for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something moving just out of the corner of my eye. I ran back into the house, clutching the doll to my chest. As I stood in the doorway, gasping for breath, I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, there was a figure standing just behind me. A child, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was Lucy, but when I turned around, the room was empty. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the softest whisper from the other side of my door. "Emily," it said, like a voice I should know. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding, but the house was silent. I knew I had to leave, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that Lucy was still here, waiting for me to remember. I packed my things the next morning, and as I walked out the door, I turned to take one last look at the house. The backyard was quiet, the oak tree standing tall against the sky. But as I glanced toward the base of the tree, I saw the faintest imprint in the dirt, small footprints leading into the woods. And I knew then that I hadn't left. Lucy was still here, waiting, just beyond the trees.